There's no time in history like this in sports media. When you cover professional sports, like, you are among the best of the best. If you love this stuff and if you are decent enough at writing, you can make a career out of this. We have the benefit now of being able to read everybody on every platform in every city. Pretty much anybody who's got something to contribute has an avenue to do it.
Asking questions and getting to the core of issues is extremely key in high performance. Knowing what to look for, how to extract the value, get the right facts, investigate, do your due diligence, and do it at a high level over a long period of time. Today you're going to meet someone who's done that over the course of 27 years, covering specifically the NBA. I've listened to his content for years. He's gotten me through my training. He's been an entertaining voice, spirit, and energy when it comes to the NBA and basketball as a whole. I'm so humbled to introduce the one and only Howard Beck, and I will initiate this interview by saying the conventional, "What up, Beck?"
What up, Jonathan? Thank you for that very kind introduction. Appreciate it. I believe you owe Zach Lowe 5 cents. Actually, he has said it's free to the world. It's like open source. It's the world is free to use it as much as they want to. No royalties due to Zach. Although sometimes I feel obligated to charge the surcharge just because we all owe Zach so much, and we should give back.
Speaking of Zach, some of those conversations, the two of you analyzing the NBA, I'm sure you get this all the time, is like just the most entertaining but also dense and hot takes that I've ever heard. Bill Simmons comes out of left field with all of these trades that would never happen in a million years, but there's this grounded perspective and approach that the two of you in particular have that really helped inform my basketball perspective. So I just want to say that before we get into it.
I appreciate that. I've had the honor and privilege of obviously being on with Zach a number of times, and of course ever since joining the Ringer last September, maybe 4, 5, 6 podcasts with Bill. I love talking NBA with both of them. It's a different vibe, and I love actually listening to the two of them together when those two do their home and home pods. That's the great thing about the NBA media space right now. We've got so many interesting voices, all coming at it from different angles, different perspectives, different styles. There's no time in history like this in sports media. I'm sure we'll get into it along the way here, but
oh yeah,
we are all fortunate to be in a media environment where pretty much anybody who's got something to contribute has an avenue to do it. And that certainly wasn't the case where, as you mentioned, 27 years ago, when I first started covering the NBA in a purely newspaper environment, mostly pre-internet, or at least pre-internet as we know it, certainly pre-podcasts and pre a lot of everything else. But great time to be alive and talking about the NBA or just about anything.
That was probably a crazy transition to go from printed paper to online to now the format that, you've hosted a podcast, The Full 48. When I met you in person, I incorrectly remembered the name, but it was a staple in my listening queue, just so you know. I'm curious, in terms of adaptability, what was that like? How did you see the media landscape evolving as you went through those transitions from the print to the digital to the audio digital, if you will?
It's funny too, and this will make more sense after I do the backstory, but I'll just say this at the outset so I don't forget. And I think I said it to you that day, but anytime somebody brings up the Full 48 now, because it's been a good 4 years since we signed off for the last time on that podcast, even though I am a writer by trade and I'm a writer at my core, and I'm a writer first and foremost in terms of my identity as a journalist and a media person, there's something about hearing somebody give me that particular shout out or compliment about the Full 48 that just, it sends a chill up my spine and it warms my heart, because I've written literally thousands of stories, and at a certain point you get just used to the idea, okay, this is my identity, this is what I do, and I'm a writer, but I'm always writing on somebody else's platform, right? I'm writing for the LA Daily News or the New York Times or Bleacher Report or Sports Illustrated, now the Ringer, and I bring what I can to the table, and you hope to make an impact, and you hope people enjoy what you're reporting on or what you're writing about. The podcast, though, And granted, I had an amazing amount of technical support back at Bleacher Report when we launched the full 48, but the podcast itself was pretty much just my baby, right? Creatively, it was just me. I booked all my own guests. I created the format. It's the one thing I've done that I felt the most ownership in. It's not that I don't own everything under my byline for the last, and it's actually more than 27 years of predating my MBA time. I've been at this for a good 30 something years, but it's just, there's something special about having that podcast, kind of ownership of that. And so anyway, thank you again for that. When people still remember the full 48 and shout it out, it hits me a different way than when they, when they say something nice about my writing. The thing is, like, there's nothing in my history, personally or professionally, up until 2000. Let's see, I went to the Bleacher Report in 2013, and the podcast started, I think, 2 or 3 years later. There's nothing in my entire life, personally or professionally, that would suggest that this is something I would have done or that I would have done competently, because I was actually a pretty shy kid. And it's becoming a reporter and becoming a journalist in college, when I decided this is the route I wanted to take and the career I wanted to pursue. It forced me out of a shell that I had been in for most of my life. It forced me to be more outgoing and assertive in a way that I wasn't used to. It just wasn't the way I was built. And then on top of that, okay, I got used to being a reporter. I'm going to ask complete strangers all these questions and be a prying, annoying journalist. But then you get used to that role. But the thing I still never saw myself as was any kind of broadcast presence, not TV, not video, not podcasting, which didn't exist for most of my career, not radio. It just wasn't what I thought I would do or that I could do. And when they came to me to ask about launching the pod, I was a little conflicted because I still thought of myself as a writer first and foremost. But at that time, I'd been at Bleacher Report for a year or two and had cranked out just a shit ton of videos. Like, I don't know how many of those are still up there to see, but like Rick Bucher and I recorded a bazillion hours of videos. And then prior to that, it was, me and Kevin Ding, Ethan Skolnick. Shout out to our great producer, Eric Newman, who coached me up during those early years. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, Jonathan. I had no clue. I did not know how to be a TV person. I did not know how to be a video person. I did not know how to do these 3-minute debates with Rick Bucher, who was way better at it because he had years at ESPN. But I learned a ton just from doing all those shows with Rick and with others. Learned a ton from Adam Lefko, Steven Nelson, all these guys who were good at it. And I became, I think, passable. I got to a point where I wasn't completely cringing at seeing my own stuff in video form, but that kind of prepared me to then be able to be a podcaster and a podcast host. And I've never listened to my earliest shows of the full 48. I'm guessing those would cause me to cringe now too, looking back. But again, think in embracing that and deciding that this is something that's fun and new and a new skill to develop has been one of the most gratifying things of this stage of my career over the last 10 years, ever since I left the New York Times and set out to kind of, try to do something different. So it was, like I say, I could not have foreseen any of that, but glad I did it.
If your old content doesn't make you cringe, then you're probably doing it wrong, right? I think that's what it's supposed to be, because that's what reflects the growth.
True.
So to come from someone who's written thousands of words, columns, minutes and hours worth, probably at this point, worth of content, I mean, what are some of the key takeaways, would you say, having done this, covering I remember following basketball as a kid and then seeing what it's transitioned into now. I mean, massive size of the contracts, the way the game is played, the way the players talk, the evolutions of the league. I'm curious, from your perspective as a professional, how did your craft in investigating and delivering the change that was happening, how did you experience that change? How did you go about articulating that change so that people could comprehend what was actually going on?
It's an interesting question. I think that there's a certain amount of this where it's the lobster in the boiling pot, right? Where actually I guess you throw the lobster in when it's already boiling. Maybe this is the frog being thrown in the boiling pot. Someone's being thrown in a pot, and it's getting hotter. Probably me. I think that the changes in the NBA, especially on the financial side of it, right? When I first started covering the league, the salary cap was probably 35, 40 million. Now there are players who are making by themselves 50 something million. And granted, stipulate here, back when the salary cap was like 30 million, Michael Jordan made like 35, which I know makes no sense to people mathematically. I'm not going to get into the machinations of the salary cap or why that was actually okay. But the salary cap is now 100 and I don't know where we're at, 120, 140, whatever we're at now.
I think it's 120.
And it's going to be, blink and it's going to be 200 million. It's like that's in our future or in the near term here in the next few years, the salary cap will be 200 million. So the salary cap rises, minimum salaries rise, the average player salary rises, and of course the max salary rises. And it's mind blowing that stars now are making 50 or 60 million in a given year. But it's all scaled to what the NBA generates. The NBA is generating in excess of 10 billion. I don't know. Now we may be up to 11 or 12 billion by now. But within the last couple of years, they hit the $10 billion mark. And player salaries and salary caps and all that stuff is all tied to league revenue. So the frog and pot analogy is that it's just happening gradually, right? This is all just happening along the way. The league is growing, interest is growing, the revenue continues to explode, and where I notice it is not so much just the raw numbers that I might be typing on a given day to reference somebody's contract. It's more, kind of the day to day where the gap between the players and the media was always pretty big anyway, certainly financially. But I think the wealthier that they've become and the more people there are around them to manage them and to quote unquote protect them as if they need protecting, the barriers between us as the media, and we're an extension of the fans, so therefore the barrier between the fans and them has gotten bigger. Access is tougher to come by. Getting to know guys on a level that I used to be able to get to know them is more difficult now. Not just for me. Like I'm a national writer these days, right? I'm not in one locker room day after day after day. I'm parachuting in. But for beat writers, which I used to be for 16 years, 7 on the Lakers and 9 on the Knicks with a slight detour to the Nets when they first moved to Brooklyn. But in those 16 years, I'm around one team all day, not all day, but I'm around one team all season, every day. Every practice, every shoot around, every game for the most part. And you get to know guys on a certain level when you have that kind of repeated contact. But even with that still being the case, there are beat writers in every NBA city doing that job. They don't have quite the same just access or ability to get to know players as I think I was fortunate to do in the late 90s and early 2000s. And the money has at least something to do with that. But there's a lot of other forces at work as well.
So let me ask you, 27 years is a very long time to be dedicated to an art like this. How did you find purpose? How did you fall in love with basketball? What is it? Or is it the writing? What is it? Where do you find purpose in what it is that you do at such a high level?
There's a lot of ways to answer that, but I'll start with, everybody loves a good origin story, right? We all love Marvel Comics and all the entire Marvel cinematic universe and everything else. You got to have origin stories, right? And I love writing about origin stories when I'm writing about, players or others that I'm writing about. My own is that I was 13 years old when Joe Montana hit Dwight Clark for the catch, as we call it. So anybody who's too young, go to YouTube and just type the catch or type Montana Clark and you'll find it. It's the NFC Championship game in 1982. It was the most exciting play, most exciting sports moment of my life to date at that point. That is what kind of cinched my fandom. I grew up in San Jose, in the Bay Area, so I was, Niner fan. When you grew up in San Jose, you don't have to pick between San Francisco and Oakland, and the Raiders were still there. So I was like, any given year, Raiders, Niners, A's, Giants. The Sharks didn't exist yet. If they did, I probably would have been a huge hockey fan. The Warriors were kind of an afterthought for most of my childhood because they sucked for most of my formative years, or at least the years I was aware of sports. But the Niners were my team primarily. And Montana to Clark was the most exciting play of my life. And it got me that much more emotionally invested in the Niners and in sports in general. And it got me reading my hometown newspaper, the San Jose Mercury News, the sports section every day. And I was reading about all the sports. I was reading everything. And I loved the writing, and I loved just the day-to-day coverage, and that fed into my fandom. But it also was probably the earliest spark of this idea that if you love this stuff, and if you are, decent enough at writing, you can make a career out of this. Like it's your formative, teenage brain is starting to put things together, and everybody's asking you about, what are you going to do when you go to college? What are you going to study? What do you want to do for a career? As if these are questions we could actually answer at age 15, 16, 17. But you have to think about it. And so it's as simplistic as that. That's how I end up on the sports writing path. The basketball part of it is almost an accident, or at least spending 27 years covering the NBA was, again, not something I could have foreseen, because if anything, when I go off to college at UC Davis in 1986, my goal was to be an NFL beat writer, right? Everybody they want to cover the sport that they were most passionate about at the time that they chose the path. And for me, it was the NFL. It was football. And, you don't realize until later that, you've got to put your fandom aside. You have to separate out the fandom from the objective role that we play as a journalist. But initially, it's, if you're a Niners fan, you think, I want to go write about the Niners. If you're a Lakers fan, you want to go write about the Lakers. Back then, too, because newspapers were the primary way to get a job covering a team on a regular basis. TV and radio existed too, of course, but I wanted to be a newspaper beat writer covering a team. So to me, it was, maybe I can go cover the Niners for my hometown San Jose Mercury News. That would have been, if you'd asked the dream of 16-year-old me, it would have been covering the Niners for my hometown paper, the San Jose Mercury News. Never did cover the Niners, although I did cover a few games just as one-off assignments. And never did write for the San Jose Mercury News, but due to the the wonders of and benefits of wire services, some of my LA Daily News Laker coverage would occasionally land in the Mercury News sports section, and my parents would, flip it and let me know, like, oh, hey, you were in the Mercury News this morning. But yeah, so it's my path to this career, especially to this last 27 years of it, doesn't make much sense given where I started out or what I thought I wanted to do. There's a 5-year detour where I'm covering local government, covering city council meetings and land use planning and development controversies and tax districts and the occasional fire. So there was that before I landed the Laker job as well in 97. So your question was about purpose. So somewhere in all of that is an answer. So I'll try to distill it. What answer would be finding purpose is trying to convey to readers, and maybe the next 13-year-old who's watching some exciting play or some game for the first time. Maybe it's Steph Curry hitting that 3 in the Olympics a few days ago, in the gold medal game. Maybe it's the Kobe to Shaq lob in 2000 that I covered during the Western Conference Finals, Game 7. Moments like that, I'm writing for the audience that wants to feel it. Either they saw it and they're reliving it through my coverage, I hope, or they missed it and I'm there to be the eyes and ears, which is what the role of a journalist has always been. So it's this obligation to this audience that you can't see or know on a given day, although through the wonders of Twitter, we now can, for better or worse, know a lot more of our audience than we used to. But it's just this idea that, your job is to capture the first draft of history, as they say. And I've always taken that very seriously. There are other subcategories within this. Like I want to consistently challenge myself in terms of the kinds of stories I'm going to write, or the way I might write them, or trying to find new ways to write about the same thing. Sports is one big cliche in a way. There's only a handful of themes that we're constantly just recycling. So the trick of it is to not feel like or sound like you're recycling it. It should sound fresh every single time. So it's that challenge too to myself as a writer to try to reinvent it every time. I mean, again, literally, like in 27 years, like I don't write every day, but like the 16 years I was a beat writer, I was writing almost every day. I was writing 200 to 300 stories a year for 16 years, and then for the last 10 or so, it's less than that. But still, do the math. Like I've covered like 2,500 basketball games or something. I've written like probably 3,000 or more stories, and that's not counting the years where I was covering planning commission meetings and fires and stuff. So you just want to continually push yourself to improve and find better ways to tell the story. And, knowing that there is an audience out there that hopefully is eager to soak it in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Inspired. My name is Jonathan Cohen, and I have a quick favor to ask you. If you're getting any value out of this content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. You help us reach more people, and you can also stay up to date with all the latest content coming your way. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll catch you in the episode. So I've interviewed a few journalists, and it's interesting. I've interviewed Ariel Helwani. I'm sure you know Mr. Helwani.
A little bit. Yeah, great guy. Great broadcaster.
Recently, I interviewed Jay Bilas. I haven't published that one yet. That was cool. And I've interviewed, I should say Jay Bilas is broadcast personality. I'd put you in that category as well. And then also Ebenezer Samuel is currently the men's health fitness director. He used to work at the New York Post, and he's gradually gotten himself to the director level at a very prominent fitness magazine. And so talking about writing, and in particular the group of high performers that in the space that you have experience being around, Zach Lowe, Bill Simmons, just a couple of the names, right? Yourself. What are some of the common themes and threads that you've seen in being around those types of individuals, that have influenced you, whether it's the culture in those particular organizations like The Ringer, let's say, or where you were at Sports Illustrated once upon a time, working with the Lakers once upon a time, the Nets. What are some of the themes and threads that you've noticed that have influenced your career and your style of writing?
So when I first started covering the Lakers, I was at the LA Daily News, the other LA paper, as I like to jokingly call it, because everybody knows the LA Times. The LA Daily News is much smaller, primarily circulated in the Valley part of LA. So I was at the second paper, right? We were the underdog. Smaller staff, didn't get paid as well. And I'm going up against, the behemoth that is the LA Times. The benefit of that was I was competing on a daily basis with some of the best sports writers in the country. So I first started covering the Lakers, and Scott Howard Cooper, who'd been covering the NBA for, a good decade by that point, is the person I'm competing against every day. And Scott had a certain way of going about the job. And then when Scott moved off the beat, Tim Kawakami moved on to the beat. Kawakami people may know from The Athletic now. And when Kawakami moved off the beat, Tim Brown moved on to the beat. And each of them, in the 7 years I'm covering the Lakers, I've got three of these guys who are all, journalists who I admired greatly as writers, as reporters. I learned from all three of them we're all at the same games and practice every day, right? I get to see how they ask questions, hear, the way that they're developing the angle of a story while we're developing our own stories at the same time, right? We're in the same, we call it a scrum. We're in the same scrum of reporters gathered around Kobe or Shaq or Rick Fox or Phil Jackson or whoever. There's the stuff that you're bringing to the table in a given day, the questions, the lines you're pursuing for your story. And then there's what your competition's doing. And a lot of it overlaps anyway, right? And there's, some exclusive stuff along the way too, where I might not have known what they were working on. And then I see it in the paper the next day and I go, oh, that's awesome. That's a great story. Now I'm going to smack myself for not thinking of that myself. But they also had distinct styles. They were very different personalities, Scott, Tim, and Tim. So I'm just constantly taking mental notes because I'm going up against these guys who are great at what they do. And I get to learn by trying to emulate some things that I liked, or I always say this to students, like, it's not about copying a writing style or copying oh, there was this great Frank DeFord piece way back in the day in SI, or Gary Smith piece, or Lee Jenkins piece. It's more that you see what works or what really resonates with you as a reader. And you go, oh, I wonder if I could do a story that way, or go find those kinds of details, or build that kind of narrative, or introduce a detail in that kind of way where they kind of made it this kind of like, surprise in the fifth paragraph. So you emulate the stuff that really works and try to take cues from the people whose work you admire the most. And so those 7 years were really critical for me as a writer, because even though I'd been in the business for a while, again, back in my news writing days, it wasn't just that I was learning how to cover the NBA, cover the Lakers. It was that I was, you know, around every day these guys who just did the job at a very high level. That's to say nothing of Bill Plaschke and Jay Adande and a bunch of others who were in, at every Laker game and practice for those 7 years. So it's just being observant. And like, it's funny you mentioned, or you asked the question about like, being around these other folks, Zach Lowe or Bill Simmons or anybody. I think the thing that maybe is the one through line for everybody in this business, and I'm just going to talk it in the NBA realm, because like, I don't, I'm not covering the NFL or baseball or everything. And I'm very tunnel vision these days. So I can only speak to the people in my own sphere. But I think the people who are the best at this, the common threads are, just an unending curiosity, right? Like you can cover a bazillion games and all these amazing moments and still have that thrill of seeing something like what Steph did in the gold medal game and wanting to be able to tell it the right way, to tell that story the right way, or to describe the play, or to ask whatever question there is of Steph in that post game that gets the response that really, sums up the moment, right? And the reporters I know who are the best at whatever it may be, writing, reporting, broadcasting, podcasting, hot taking, whatever it is, it's because there's a creativity and an energy and a curiosity and an analytical mindset that just doesn't stop, where you come to the table every day with that same intensity. And, again, like sports is very repetitive. There's only a handful of themes, but the people who are great at this are don't allow themselves to be jaded by that aspect of it. And again, I feel very fortunate to know so many of these folks, and people like David Aldridge, whose work I admired from the moment I started covering the NBA. David was at ESPN at the time, and then he was back in newspapers, and then at Turner, and somebody who I'm just very fortunate to have gotten to know over the years. Any number of friends in the business, Sam Amick and Casey Johnson and Marcus Thompson, Anthony Slater. Like I could list you a bunch of names, and if we had the time, which we don't, I could tell you what I've really appreciated about all of them over the years, not just in terms of their friendship, but in their work, because this is a business where there's an ecosystem. No one's choosing, especially today. It used to be like you pick up this newspaper, and if you heard about this person writing on the other side of the country, it was maybe through wire services, or maybe they were on sports reporters on ESPN or something. We have the benefit now of being able to read everybody on every platform in every city. And what makes our ecosystem within the NBA media so great is that there is just this amazing wealth and diversity of voices. And I'm better for being in the midst of that every day.
You touched on curiosity, and there's another question I want to ask you. I don't want to forget. We'll kind of just put it on the shelf. Maybe you could weave it into the question I'm going to ask now. Curiosity is very important, and I love how you characterized it as never ending. How have you cultivated curiosity? And then the other aspect that I want to touch on is being around Kobe, Shaq, all these other wild NBA players and talents. Has their work ethic, like the Kobe work ethic that gets rightfully, in my opinion, I read his book, I've watched hours of content, a work ethic that is unmatched to a large degree. Did that influence you at all? Did you feel that? Did you experience it? And if you did, how so?
It's really funny you asked that, Jonathan. Yes, It absolutely did. And I think one of the interesting things about covering, like, I think you used the phrase high achievers at one point earlier in our conversation. But one thing about when you cover professional sports, like you were among the best of the best. I will never be as good a reporter or writer as Kobe Bryant was a basketball player. But when you're around the Kobe's and Shaq's and Phil Jackson's, or when you talk to Steph Curry or LeBron James or any of these folks, actually, all the way down to the 450th player, right? There's 450 players at any given time in the NBA. Even the 450th best player in the NBA is one of the best in the world at what he does. I'm not going to try to tell you the work ethic is across the board even, because it's not. There's a reason why some guys are top 5 and some guys have top 5 type talent, but they're only top 30, or they've made a couple of all-star teams. But like, there are a lot of guys with talent. There are not a lot of guys who have the drive of a Kobe Bryant. That's probably an unfair and impossible standard. But the point is that when you're around that kind of greatness all the time, it's not that you're not walking in every day in awe of their talent. You do get a little bit numb to the things that they can do, their athletic feats. It's just kind of the norm. But I think what never goes away is admiring the dedication to their craft. And Kobe was the epitome of that. And I'm here to tell you, as somebody who was, there for 7 years, none of that is mythologized. None of that is hyperbole. The stuff about Kobe is real. Like, he was that maniacal about basketball, for better or worse, because it was at the expense of a lot of other things for a long time. And it was both admirable and also a little bit off-putting at times, because it was at the expense of everything else, and at times I felt like was at the expense of some of his humanity. He did have that whole period of time where he was estranged from his family and estranged from his first agent, Arn Tellem, and had some tough moments with those of us in the media who covered him every day. And I had a great relationship with Kobe, especially after I left LA. It's always harder when you're the one there every day. For every high and low, you become annoying after a while, which is fair. But we had a great relationship and a great mutual respect. But I will tell you absolutely positively, it has hit me more than once over the years that watching him, observing the way he carried himself and in his dedication to his craft, that it's the kind of thing where you cannot help but feel like, okay, I can do a little more. Like, this is somebody who is doing this at this incredible level, who's getting up at 3 a.m. Like, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing the version of the writer version of getting up at 3 a.m. to go lift weights or whatever, or get up 1,000 shots. I don't know what the writer version of that is. I'm not doing it, but it is an admirable standard to which you can sort of aspire, right? Like, I've got the Mamba Mentality book is sitting up here behind me somewhere. People in every walk of life, it seems like now, who were Kobe fans, try to internalize some aspect of that or aspire to it. And, that's a real thing. It's part of why we admire these guys. Again, it's not just the spectacle and what they can do athletically. It's that it's always the culmination of all the work that they put in. He wasn't doing it at age 10. He's had a whole lifetime of perfecting his shot and perfecting shots at tough angles and off balance and off one foot and everything. Like, these things. That shot the other day, again, that's like the 4th time I've referenced the gold medal game, but that last shot, which had even me on the couch, like, I feel like I've seen everything, Jonathan, and still at that moment, I'm sitting with my daughter on the couch and we're going like, oh, like, I'm not cheering, I'm not clapping, I'm not invested emotionally, but you cannot help but have an emotional reaction to just because you're in awe. And, that's the beauty of sport, is that you can't see those moments coming. You could still be surprised by them every time and inspired by them. And again, and know that there's a lot of preparation that went into that. Steph doesn't do that by accident.
I was watching the game with my daughter also, and I had that same visceral reaction where it's just amazing. That was just one of those you get out of your seat type of shots with the stakes so high. I can't believe I'm talking basketball with Howard Beck right now, just so you know. This is pretty cool. I'm just saying. But it was just one of those moments where, like you said, you have this innate reaction that excites you, that even if you're not emotionally invested. I was a bit because, you know, USA, right? But at the same time, like, as much as I've loved this sport, there's definitely been a time. I remember, I'll tell you the story. I'm a big Nets fan. That is probably how I initially learned about your work. And I remember game 7 against the Bulls. Nate Robinson goes off for like 40. I don't remember what year it was, maybe like
2013,
something like that. Yeah,
13 or 14.
I was like a junior
13.
in college. Yeah, I went to that game, and I remember seeing the players just very like, they just didn't really care on the bench. I saw how the Chicago Bulls players celebrated like every moment, and I just remember seeing the Nets bench not caring whether they scored or didn't score, like no emotional investment. And they lost the game. I went home. I lost sleep that night. And I remember waking up being like, that's never going to happen again. I'm never going to let the emotion of a team that doesn't even care about themselves get me to lose sleep. That really emotionally impacted me and allowed me to channel energy into other areas of life that's led to obviously results that I have now. But I still have very emotional reactions when the Nets do well, don't do well. But that's an aside. When you look at your career and you look back on all the articles and hours and energy that you put in and reflect on how this process of becoming one of those names that you mentioned on that list, how do you want to be remembered as a writer and as a contributor to covering sports and as a journalist and as an educator?
Wow. That's a heavy question. I'm gonna think about that for a second. While I'm processing that question, I pulled up the box score. Two players for the Bulls in that game 7 had 24 points. Neither of them was Nate Robinson, who had 12. Could you guess which two Bulls players had 24 points that day? Because it's not who I would have guessed.
Luol Deng and Joakim Noah?
Joakim had 24 with 14 rebounds and 6 blocks. Holy crap. The other 24-point scorer for the Bulls that day, the legendary Marco Bellinelli.
Wow, I never would have guessed that.
You would not have. Neither would I have.
Didn't Nate Robinson have like 40-something that game?
This is game 7. He had 12. And so it was probably, I know the game you're talking about. I think that might have been was the prior game.
Yeah, maybe it was the prior game because, I think it was the prior game. But he still hit some big shots in that game 7.
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think it had 12 points. Maybe it was all in the fourth quarter. It's not important enough to go back and look. But he had a 34-point game in game 4 of that series.
Okay.
Nate did.
That's what it was.
So anyway, when I was a huge Niner fan in my teen years and into my 20s, that was the one team in my life that I really lived and died with. And so I do know what it's like to be a fan and have that kind of emotional investment where they can just ruin your entire day or your week. And because in football, they lose and it's like you're miserable the whole week until they play again. Or if they lost a playoff game, then it's just, a miserable 6 months. And so I do know that feeling, but it's so distant for me. Like I have not lived and died with the team for a very, very long time now. So I don't have the pain, the anguish, the frustration. I don't get the joy of it either necessarily. Some people think that's some sort of minor tragedy. I don't think so. I'm perfectly happy to be in this completely distanced 30,000 foot view position. Okay, so you asked how I want to be remembered. Hopefully there's still a lot more to remember, that my career's not ending anytime soon, or I'm going to be around for a bit. In terms of what I do and what I hope people appreciate about it, like I hope that every time they read something, they recognize that a lot of thought and effort went into it. Like I agonize over, I don't want to say every word, but there are days where it feels like every word. And I do agonize over every sentence and the flow of a story and whether I've told this in the right order. I've agonized over which quotes to use. I've agonized even more of which quotes not to use, which to cut, because if I used every every little factoid, every quote, every observation that I had, some of these stories would be 5 or 10,000 words and nobody would get through it. So the challenge of writing as a journalist is always distilling. I use that word a lot when I'm talking to students or people who are younger in the business. The job is not to smash everything in there. Gather as much information as you can, as many facts, as many observations, as many stats, as many whatever. But the job is not to use all of it. You're not trying to bludgeon the reader. You're trying to enlighten them on some level. It's about distilling. It's about kind of you're constantly chiseling away and finding just the best, most illustrative pieces of information or quotes. And so I agonize over all of that. And so that what you hope comes through for the reader is that I put in all this effort to make this look like it actually, you're putting a lot of effort to make it hopefully look effortless, to read effortlessly. Like if you want it to flow, right? You want, like, the best compliment you can give to somebody in my business, especially if it was a 2,000 or 3,000 word story, is like, oh man, that was a really breezy read, or that was a really quick read. Or like if my editor says, if I say, man, I wrote too long in this one, if he says, didn't feel like 2,500 words, that's the greatest thing I can hear from my editor, is it didn't feel like X number of words. It felt shorter because it meant that it was a good flow. There was it was entertaining. It didn't bog down because I was jamming in too many stats or play-by-play or something. I don't know. Like it's a really hard thing to think about. Like, how do you want people to consider your body of work? I hope that I've, on some level, informed and entertained, right? In sports writing, like in journalism in general, it's about informing and enlightening people and keeping them up to date on and abreast of what's going on in the world and whatever part of the world that you're covering. In sports, entertainment is baked in a way that it isn't necessarily if you were covering, say, the cops and courts beat, which is, if you're entertained by it, that would be a little perverse. Sports has to be entertaining too. And especially as I've grown into these other roles, as a podcaster, as a video person, as whatever, you hope that you're not just informing people, but that you're doing it in a way that is fun, that is entertaining on some level, without getting performative or hot takey. I've never been a hot take person. I may have some takes. I usually refer to them as lukewarm takes because I actually care about nuance and, counterbalancing facts and stuff. So I do have some strong opinions on a few things occasionally, but I hope it's more of an even-handed approach, and I hope that people appreciate that part of it too. Like that's how you really want to be remembered in this business. On top of everything else, is were they fair? I won't. You don't have to agree with everything I've said or written, or every bit of analysis, but as long as you recognize that I was fair and thorough and respectful of the facts and respectful of the people that I covered, that I could be critical without being, mean-spirited or taking cheap shots. That's what you hope people will recognize and appreciate.
So I've really had an awesome time getting to understand the way I already understood the way that you think, because I've listened to hours of you speak. I've read your work, and I got the chance to meet you and now sit down with you. I think that the question that I posed previously, it's very difficult, but I think it's an important one for people to think about, because introspection and constantly remembering our reasons for why we do what we do. I mean, hearing from your perspective, the importance that you place on the reader and the audience. I mean, that's why you've accumulated such a massive audience on Twitter alone, right? That kind of impact and that responsibility that you take on, and the focus that you've put on the audience, on the reader, the purpose through service, right? And I think when we reflect, I mean, on a daily basis, when I do what I do, I try to always make it about someone else. And hearing how you've internalized that as what I would consider a tenet in your practice, even subtly or subconsciously, it's always about how you can give the reader an optimal experience and how you can level up your skill set to serve the audience. It's a testament to such a vast and dense and substantive career. So there's a question that I pose to all my guests that I'm not going to pose to you. If the future version of yourself from 10 years from now were to fly in and offer you some advice in order to get there, what do you think he would say to you?
Whoa, man. Save your money better, because we're retiring, and we need a good solid solid nest egg here to get through the next however many years. Yeah, like there's a little bit of that, frankly, but it's funny because if you had asked about the 10 years, like the inverse of this, like what would you want to tell yourself of 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago? The funny thing is that no matter how you do this thought exercise, the fact is, like, the media landscape has changed so dramatically in the course of my lifetime and in the course of my career. I graduated college in 1991. And so I've been at this a while in various capacities, and you can't anticipate any of the changes that we've lived through and witnessed, and the amount of adaptability that has been necessary to just stay relevant and to keep growing. And once upon a time, I would have thought I would have spent my entire life in newspapers, and I left newspapers. It's been 11 years now, and probably not going back. There's some part of me that's wistful about that, to be honest. I loved working at the New York Times, and I love newspapers, and I'm still a Times subscriber, and I'm still a newspaper guy at heart. We like to refer to ourselves as ink-stained wretches. I'm still an ink-stained wretch at heart. So the me of 10 years from now, coming back, I hope he tells me that we continued to be nimble and adaptive, and that we've hopefully wrote a few more, at least a handful of stories that really made an impact. Maybe finally did a book after threatening to for however many years and not doing it. Maybe we've done a book or two. Maybe one of them's got an option for a movie to then help fund that retirement account that I was referring to. Yeah, I don't know. That's a wild one. I guess I got to go steal a DeLorean and some plutonium. See what I can find out.
Howard, I've had an awesome time hanging out with you tonight. Please let the audience know where they can keep up with your journey.
Kids, that was a Back to the Future reference, by the way. If you haven't seen the movie, go indulge. Michael J. Fox, the best. Everybody can find my work, of course, at theringer.com. And I'm on Twitter at Howard Beck, for better or worse, still on Twitter. Yeah, those are the main places to find me. Every Monday, during the NBA season every Monday on the Real Ones podcast, where I have the joy of talking about the NBA with Logan Murdoch and Raja Bell.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No, Jonathan, my pleasure, man. Thanks for having me. Thanks for all the great questions. You actually, I had to think. This is the off season. My brain is supposed to be relaxing. You actually made me have to think a little bit, but thank you for that. It's been a fun conversation.
My pleasure.